Welcome back to Brighter Morning with Bhoe. We're glad to have you on board. I hope you enjoyed that last interview if you were watching or listening. This is MCTV, Multicultural TV, and U97.5 FM, Hot Like Pepper Radio, Multicultural Radio. And this is Brighter Morning with Bhoe. I am Bhoe Tiwari. And our next guest is Dr. Valmikki Arjoon. We'll talk to him shortly. But before that, I just want to, one of the stories that Chanel Alsuran raised in her news this morning was the issue of what was happening in Afghanistan. And I want to say that that could turn out to be a very terrible kind of situation there. You know, the Taliban is very strongly supported by forces in Pakistan, and that border is fairly open to them and they have access. And what has been happening is that the Taliban has been gaining more and more ground as the Americans prepare to leave. That decision to leave Afghanistan was taken by President Trump and being carried out now by President Biden. And what is happening here now, as the troops begin to leave, you have two problems, which is that the Taliban is basically taking territory after territory, and the government is largely limited now to the city, which it controls. How long they'll be able to hold on, we don't know. And the second issue is that a lot of people who helped the Americans when they were there in full throttle fighting with the Afghanistan troops against the Taliban, a lot of those people are now compromised and face death if they were to stay in that country as allies of the U.S., and they will be put to death by the Taliban. They have done it before, and they will do it again. And many of those people are seeking desperately to get out of the country and to get to the United States. Some of them have been approved by the administration, and they have gotten out, but not as many as in fact were involved with the Americans there. So that's a very dicey situation that is taking place. We don't know what will happen after the American troops leave and whether the Afghanistan forces are going to be able to hold on to their country after the Americans are gone. I want to indicate that the Russians were in fact in Afghanistan before the Americans, before the United States. And they spent almost a decade there and had to leave. You know, this is what happens when you have a big country move into another country and you have a resistance movement emerging that is very nationalist and anti-foreign invasion and rule. And so this is something that we have to look at. The other thing that we need to take into account is what's happening with COVID in Trinidad and Tobago. I heard the president of Guyana say in one of his statements that Chanel Alsuran carried in her news item in the earlier news at 6. He said that, you know, COVID is not just a health issue, it's an economic issue too. And the vaccinations, of course, are not just a health issue, it's a economic issue. And the situation in Trinidad and Tobago, where we are now at 1,092 deaths, could not be comforting in Trinidad and Tobago as people continue to get infected, as people continue to die, and as while the mass vaccination drive continues apace with collaboration between government, private sector, and NGOs, you have a situation emerging where there is some hesitancy and resistance to the vaccine, which can have serious implications not only for health, but for economic issues in our country. So to address some of these economic issues now, we have a young economist, very capable, teaching at the University of the West Indies and doing his own research and publications locally and internationally. And that person is none other than Dr. Valmikki Arjoon. He's on the line now? He's not on yet? Okay. So he's not on yet, so we'll have to wait for him to get on. And he will talk with us a little bit about what is, how he sees it, basically, in Trinidad and Tobago, how he sees what is emerging, what is happening in Trinidad and Tobago, how he sees us moving forward in a progressive way, in a constructive way, how he sees the possible solutions that we might want to pursue. All of these things we will explore with him. Are we, do we have him on yet? Do you have him on the phone? Were you able to connect? Let's see if we can get him on. So I should tell you that what we have had recently as the most recent international news is basically an assessment or a reading from Standard & Poor's, which is one of the rating agencies that overlooks what's happening in Trinidad and Tobago, as they do for many countries all over the world. And we need to look at that report and what the report says, and to see, get Dr. Arjoon's impression or perspective on what the report means for Trinidad and Tobago and where we are headed. The other thing that we need to be aware of is that I forget her first name now, but Ms. Gopinath, who is the chief economist at the IMF, recently she was talking about what is happening in the industrialized world, what is happening in the developing or emerging world. And she was talking about the gap that is emerging as vaccinations are not available to the emerging world and the developing world, and as the big countries, the industrialized countries, vaccinate their own people. Now, you have a problem of vaccination hesitancy in the industrialized world. You certainly have it in the United States, where President Biden is expressing deep concern and worry about it. And he's speaking to people, trying to persuade people to get vaccinated. But these are people in a country that has the vaccine that don't want it. We have a situation in Trinidad and Tobago where, after a lot of fumbles and missteps, the government was able to secure vaccines here from Sinopharm. And we now have available 400 doses, enough to vaccinate fully 400,000 people in Trinidad and Tobago, which would take us to about 600,000, which would be just about half of the population. It's not enough, but it's a lot. And here we have people also who do not wish to be vaccinated, so we have vaccination hesitancy here. But you have a lot of countries all over the world in which less than 1% of the population has been vaccinated, in which less than 2% of the population has been vaccinated, in which less than 3% of the world has been vaccinated. And that is not because they don't want vaccine. It's because they cannot get. So Ms. Gopinath from the IMF is talking about this vaccination availability gap and what it will mean in economic terms as the industrialized countries proceed with their business of building a formidable and competitive economy, and emerging and developing countries are left behind. So these are things that we need to keep in mind. We'll explore some of them with Dr. Arjoon, but we want to welcome him on board. Thank you for coming on the program, Dr. Arjoon.
Good morning, Dr. Tiwari, and thank you for having me on the program. Good morning to all your viewers as well.
Yes, well, thank you for being here. And I want to get straight into it because you are what you might call a financial economist. And recently, Standard & Poor's gave their report on Trinidad and Tobago. Could you, I'm sure that you've read that report and looked at it and thought about what it means for Trinidad and Tobago. So could you tell me a little bit what it says, what that report says means, and how what that report says and means will affect Trinidad and Tobago? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, certainly. Okay, so it's very important to remember that this particular ratings exercise that was done by Standard & Poor's kept our ratings the same as it was last year. So the rating did not change. We maintained the BBB negative, BBB minus rating. But the other element, however, that did in fact change was the outlook. Okay, so we went from a stable outlook to a negative outlook. Now, right now, in fact, since last year's rating, we were in the last notch of what you call the investment grade region. Now, usually, in most cases, at the time the ratings exercise is done, the outlook is going to predict the possible direction of the next rating. So, usually a stable outlook would mean that there's a good chance the rating is not going to change in the next ratings exercise. So if last year they gave us a stable outlook, then it makes sense that this year the rating in fact did not change. But a negative outlook, however, which is what we've gotten this year, it means that chances are S&P is likely to downgrade us in the next ratings exercise, most likely in 2022. It was expected that in this particular ratings exercise, the outlook, at least the outlook would have changed. And like I said, it would signal the possibility of a downgrade to BB positive, which is the first category of the junk or speculative grade region, according to S&P. And what we should also keep in mind is that Moody's, the other credit rating agency, the other noteworthy credit rating agency that rates us each year, they put us in the speculative grade region back in 2017 when they would have changed our rating from Baa3 to Ba1. Okay, so since 2017, we would have been in the junk or speculative grade region. Now, what does that really mean for TNT? When you are in the investment grade region, it means that the global community, they deem you at least having sufficient capacity to meet your debt repayment obligations. Our debt to GDP ratio is somewhere in the vicinity of about 85% at this point in time. Okay, the most recent data from the IMF, from the central bank, would put our net public sector debt to GDP ratio close to 85%. Now, investment grade means we are deemed as having sufficient or adequate capabilities for meeting our debt repayment obligations, but it could possibly change given certain local or global economic shocks. But if we move to speculative grade, which is where we are likely to go to according to Standard & Poor's next year, it means that likely our debt repayment capacity, our ability to meet our financial obligations is going to be riskier and is going to be more uncertain given our adverse economic and financial conditions in the country that will place us in a very financially vulnerable position. And again, we would have been regarded as being in this position already by Moody's since 2017.
Yeah, that 2017 rating by Moody's, though, BA1, basically, it also carried with it a negative outlook. So you might say Moody's was a little more aggressive in their assessment of Trinidad and Tobago as a negative outlook domain in assessing the investment prospects of the country, no?
You see, what Standard & Poor's tends to do, what they would have done for several years rather, is they take into account our foreign reserves, our total foreign reserves, and our total Heritage and Stabilization Fund value. And they take that away from the overall debt position with a view that, and in my opinion, it's not a good view to hold. But their idea is that if we cannot meet our financial obligations, especially our debt repayment obligations, we can always tap into the HSF, or we can always tap into our foreign reserves to be able to pay out that debt, particularly or more so our international debt. Now, of course, while it is positive that we have the HSF and the foreign reserve account, it is not really good practice or credible practice rather to tap into those avenues or those reserves to be able to repay our loans. Whenever we go into those accounts, we need to use those funds to foster new investment opportunities in the country, to build productive capacity, new revenue earning mechanisms, so that we will be able to create additional development prospects in the economy and still have monies left over at the same time to be able to repay our debt. Those monies ought to be used to create new revenue enhancing purposes, not to just go in there to pay off existing loans already. That is bad practice. But the mere existence of those funds is a key reason why S&P has kept us in the investment grade rating for this long, as opposed to the other ratings agency, Moody's.
But let us talk about that a little bit. In terms of U.S. reserves, Trinidad and Tobago, based on the central bank numbers, has about $7 billion, right? 7 billion US. It might be a little less than that now. The HSF has about $5.7 billion. And in real terms, I mean, and compared to our neighbors in the region, we may be seen as doing okay. We're not so bad. We have 6-7 months of import cover. We have a savings accumulated over many years, etc. But the problem is this. As you yourself said, the borrowing level is now at 85, actually 86% of GDP. And we recently, less than 2 weeks ago, borrowed another hefty sum from the Andean Development Bank, CAF. So that would have gone up, taking us perhaps close to 90%. And if you have U.S. reserves, if you have money in the HSF and you are borrowing significant amounts of money, then, I mean, you really can't count the amount that you have in the reserves as being the amount, the number that it says. And the second thing is that if you have a balance of trade problem and therefore a balance of payments issue, and you have $7 billion in the reserves, and you are depleting that predictably year by year, and you are doing nothing substantial to deal with import substitution and reduction, and you are doing nothing significantly known or understood or calculable for export outside of energy, for new sources of foreign exchange income. I mean, that also makes the 7 billion US reserves, I mean, put some pressure on it. So could you talk about that a little bit,
Right.
and how
Well,
concerned we should be about these things?
Right. So what we have to remember is that the reserves is actually about 6.6 billion at this point. When we borrow funds from abroad, and when we take funds out of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, when we take money out of that fund, that is in US dollars, but we don't spend US dollars here in TNT. The government doesn't spend US dollars here locally. So what happens is that the central bank will convert that money into TT dollars, which is then used for to meet their expenditure obligations. Now, obviously, that money the US dollars just doesn't disappear. It goes into the foreign reserve account. So when you take monies out of the HSF or you borrow it from abroad, it artificially bumps up your foreign reserve account. So that figure you're seeing there, 6.6 billion, is actually an artificially inflated figure. If we were to deduct the amounts that we would have taken out in debt and from the HSF, by now it will probably be somewhere in the vicinity between 2 to 3 billion US dollars instead, which is what we would have which would comprise what we would have pragmatically earned from our export earnings and from, for example, tax revenue earnings in US dollars from the energy sector, etc. So we have to really keep that in mind. That 6.6 billion you're seeing there in the foreign reserve account is an artificial figure at the end of the day. Now, what gives us really and truly our foreign exchange earnings is really the international trade aspect of our transactions, our activities. From 2015 to 2019, we would have recorded an overall total deficit of $4.5 billion US dollars in our balance of payments accounts. Now, usually we hear about the current account or balance of trade, but that's really one aspect of the international trade accounts. I think we need to look at it holistically by looking at the overall balance of payments figure. The balance of payments figure is looking at the total outflows relative to inflows of foreign exchange into the country. It looks at all your international transactions with your foreign counterparts, be it with tangible goods, be it with services, or also be it with financial instruments like stock, bonds, investments abroad, etc. Because all of these things require the movement of US dollars, doesn't it? So we look at the overall balance of payments account, and that would have recorded an overall deficit, or an outflow rather, of $4.5 billion between 2015 to 2019. Now, this year gone by, in 2020, we would have gotten a tiny surplus, a small surplus of about $28.4 million. But that's really because of the effects of the pandemic. We would have seen a fall in imports because a large segment of the private sector would have been shut down for various months. And then those who would have managed to reopen their operations, some of them, or many of them rather, would have trimmed down or downscaled their operations, which would have meant certain less imports happening from some of these organizations. But in addition to this, what would have augured, well, I wouldn't say well, because it really is a reflection of lower economic activity, lower production activity, etc. But what would have served to trim some of our imports last year was really the supply chain problems globally. Supply chain problems where many of our suppliers of raw materials, retail items, etc., they too would have been shut down. So imports weren't available from them in the first place. And if there were, there would have been several time lags in order to acquire these items here in TNT. A lot of trade routes were shut down as well. So getting these items on time, imported or getting them at all, was extremely problematic. And then if you were able to get them, you're getting them at high prices. So that would have served to curtail the level of imports from Trinidad and Tobago as well. Now, the export side of things, it did also fall last year. So we would have seen that our energy exports fell from about 6.9 billion US dollars in 2019 to only about $4.3 billion in 2020. The non-energy export side of things also fell by about 11%, from 1.8 billion to about 1.6 billion over the same period. But what was very interesting and also somewhat a ray of light at the end of the tunnel, although I don't really think we are at the end of the tunnel as yet, is that our non-energy exports in the last quarter of 2020, that actually went up by about 22% relative to the last quarter of 2019. And that really could have been due to manufacturing activities, particularly, not necessarily a growth in their activities, but more rather an increase in the demand for their exports coming out of other countries like the United States and more developed economies. Because in the last quarter, coming out to the end of 2020, when these countries started to reopen their borders, they started to reopen their various economic sectors, it meant a surge, a huge swelling in demand activities and consumption activities and business activities as a whole when their private sectors reopened. So persons got back into their jobs. People would have started spending more money because to make up for the loss in spending during the pandemic that they would have experienced. So that surge in demand caused them to increase their level of exports, which would have augured well for our manufacturing sector, allowing them to increase some of their items for the US market and even for the EU market and in the Asian market as well, because the Asian economies would have somewhat rebounded at the end of last year as well. So that really was somewhat of a saving grace for Trinidad and Tobago at the last quarter, especially closer to November, December last year, where we had a very small uptick in our non-energy exports, particularly our manufacturing exports. In addition to this, because of the shutdown of many elements of the private sector, they would have reduced their imports of certain services like technical services, trade-related services, etc. But on the financial side of things, we would have seen another deficit of about 151 million US, which was really because of outflows of investments or outflows of funds from foreign investors from Trinidad and Tobago. So we hear a lot about foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment has been in a negative region over the last 5 years. If you were to total the amount of FDIs for Trinidad and Tobago over the last 5 years as a whole, that would be in the vicinity of just over 1.5 billion US dollars, which means that foreign investors are taking their monies out of Trinidad and Tobago and rather not investing it here in TNT. And that is also what accounts for part of our balance of payments deficit when you look on the financial side of the account as well. And then we also have to take into account our huge net errors and omissions, a big element of our balance of payments account, which was about 6.6 billion US dollars in the last 5 years. That is monies leaving our shores, monies leaving our shores that are really not accounted for. Could have been happening because of illicit activities. Some of it may have happened because of hot money outflows, where on the financial side of things, investors are just simply not happy with keeping their monies here in TNT. So businesses are taking their monies out and deciding to invest elsewhere in other countries where they think they could get a higher level of return. And some of it could be due to things like trade misinvoicing as well, where if you were to import or export certain amount of goods and a certain amount of goods and services, but the bill, your invoice rather, has a completely different figure, which is what some businesses tend to do, and we have to really face up to this big elephant in the room. But it is a big part of a leakage of foreign currency in the country, where they misinvoice and they avoid paying taxes because of that misinvoicing. And they're able to hoard foreign exchange US dollars elsewhere in accounts abroad. Things like offshore banking as well, where certain investors want to not pay their fair share of taxes, and maybe engaging in some kind of illicit or black market activity. So they're keeping their monies abroad to avoid regulation and to avoid legislation and the law here in TNT. That also accounts for a significant part of the outflows of US dollars from Trinidad and Tobago. So these are just some of the factors that would account for our shortages of US dollars here in TNT. And of course, we have the very big factor, which is really and truly the downturn in our energy production.
Yeah.
So we would have seen that our exports, our energy exports fell substantially over the last several years. In fact, when we look at the production data, you would see that natural gas production would have fallen from about 4.11 billion standard cubic feet per day in January 2015 to about where the latest data from the central bank puts it at about 2.56 billion cubic feet per day in April 2021. That's a 36% drop.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
quite significant
36% drop in production, and that's only natural gas. On the oil side of things, there would have been about a 30% drop from about 83,900 barrels per day to about 56,400 barrels per day. Of course, if you're not producing, then your export levels are quite likely to be low as well.
All right. So let's take the macro issues that you have flagged and look at the micro impact on the population and business, and the combination of the impact of the macro dimension economically and financially together with the COVID impact and see what is happening to our country. Okay? So you have growing debt, and the minister seems to have an appetite for debt, which more than covers the amount of money that you have in the HSF. You have an imbalance of trade in favor of imports, not in our best interest, except for that fourth quarter in 2020 when we seem to have had a manufacturing push. You have serious drops in gas and oil production and reduction of exports in the energy sector. And you really have a situation in which, as price takers for a high import economy for everything that comes here, all of that is now finding itself in the marketplace to, first of all, the businesses that are importing, and ultimately the consumer in Trinidad and Tobago, whose cost of living and quality of life is affected. Can you talk about that a little bit? I have some clips that I want to share with you, but if you could talk for just like 1 minute on that, I'll show the clips and then you can speak after that.
Certainly. Well, what we found, and it's not just happening last year, it's actually continuing this year, but for different reasons. The vast majority of the private sector, those that were able to keep their operations going on over 2021 and the latter part of 2020, they've been seriously marred by supply chain issues globally. So it's not really just about local factors, but also about global factors as well, global obstacles to doing business. Because of the increase in the pent-up demand, the increase in consumption and investment activities going on all over the world, a lot of businesses have ramped up their imports of raw materials, machinery, ingredients for the overall production process, for example, if they are food processors, and what have you. So there's a substantial increase in the importation and purchases of various items, but those are items that our manufacturers, our local retailers also need here to sustain their operations as well. But because the demand is so high for it across the world, suppliers are just not able to meet all of it. So what they're doing, they're picking and choosing who they send it to, and the prices, of course, would have gone up because there's basically a shortage of it on the market. So take our manufacturers, for example. Many of them have to wait longer, and they have to pay more money in order to import whatever raw materials that they need, whatever equipment that they need, etc., to facilitate their operations. That delays their operations, and that drives up the cost of their operations as well. not to mention also that the cost of their operations would have also been driven up because of the cost of international shipping, international freights, etc., would have substantially increased since December last year. So the overall cost of doing business has really gone up. And in addition to that, remember, many of them would have had to close their operations last year, would have faced a decline in sales revenues since last year as well. So if by some miracle they did happen to reopen their doors for business, many of them would have had to keep less workers on their payroll, which means that a lot more households would have been affected by unemployment. The IDB did a short survey last year for the region. What they found is that in TNT alone, about 68% of low-income households by August last year were affected by job losses. And even if some companies did manage to reopen their doors, they may not have been able to hire the quantum of workers that they would have had before, which meant that a lot more people would have continued or remained incomeless for the month and be unable to feed themselves and their families. So businesses as a whole are marred by not just the typical ease of doing business problems and financing problems that they face here in TNT, but a huge increase in the cost of doing business because of the global supply chain issues and because of the global transportation issues as well. And you have other problems where they're unable to get access to adequate foreign exchange. But the lockdown in itself, the restrictions in itself would have affected their profitability, affected their revenue generation capacity as a whole, which would in turn not allows them to hire a sufficient amount of workers to hire an adequate number of people on their payroll, which then in turn affects our purchasing power, affects the purchasing power of many households, affects their pockets, affects their ability to sustain their livelihoods, etc., thereby overall exacerbating the poverty levels in our country.
Okay, so that what we have in fact is that we have a fall in the gross domestic product, the GDP, by almost 10%.
In fact, our GDP, if we were to look at the figures, our GDP, and we have to really get a good idea of how bad the situation has gotten, our GDP would have fallen by close to 17% between 2015 and 2020. Over that 6-year period, you're looking at a 17% drop in our real gross domestic product, our production levels in the country. And that is not even taking into account price levels. I remember we've taken out the element of price levels and inflated prices from that figure. That is a substantial figure to go by, and it's likely to drop again in this year, especially if the manufacturing sector, if they're unable to really take advantage of the increase in demand for their products from abroad and increase the scale of their operations. If that can't happen, and there are, like I said, serious obstacles to that happening because of the cost of doing business, given the supply chain issues, etc., we are very much likely to find our economy declining again by, at the very least, 6% in 2021.
Yeah, and that GDP drop is reflective in the functioning of business and the extent to which they are able to manage themselves, so that you really have a devastating effect on business. And you also have in each household as well a significant drop. So the GDP drop finds itself flowing into the business sector and each business, and also in each household in a very significant way that impacts on people. Can we very quickly look at what Vivek Charan had to say on this matter?
That critically, there's a disconnect between small business, and small and medium businesses. That is not huge, large conglomerates and so on. There's a disconnect between how we operate and what our actual reality is, and perhaps what the government and the ministries in the government think we operate, or what they believe to be our reality. The correct description is that it has not been adequate.
Okay.
And when we look at the arguments put forward for lockdowns in more developed nations, it is because in more developed nations, you looked at huge stimulus packages or huge packages, fiscal packages that were put out there to support many of the small businesses. If you want to help, then help. How can you help and then hang it out of the reach of the people? The second thing is that the moratoriums that were offered by the banks turned out to be quite a burden for many. And after you took a moratorium at one time, you certainly cannot then go back and take a moratorium at another time.
And let us have the two clips from Is There Not a Cause? And the head of Is There Not a Cause, Ms. Hector.
Things we joke about in Trinidad and among the poor people, this is my trust week. What my trust week means, Doc, is that it's the last week of month end, and there's more month than money. So whatever little groceries or whatever little things I would have done, it's finished like within that third week. And I'm skating. Some people don't have money to go to work on that last month. That is the reality for many people in Trinidad and Tobago. People talking about 6 months salary save up. These people don't have 6 days salary. They're living day by day by day. And so now right, so you couple that now with what is happening, Doc, the lockdowns,
All right. Okay. So here we get a business point of view, and he's a retailer, Vivek Charan, and a good. I don't know what your economic figures tell you, but I know for sure that the retail sector of Trinidad and Tobago is at least 40%. It probably is more than that. So there is an issue. And then secondly, I mean, the jobs that are dependent on those sectors. And then you have Ms. Hector there talking about the condition of ordinary people, unable really to deal with food and so on. I want to get to some solutions or recommendations from you, but very quickly, could you comment on what is happening there? You have an international problem of trade, you have a lockdown locally, you have business crisis, and you have household crisis.
Now, if you look at what's happening in the United States would have spent or approved close to about $6 trillion since 2020 because of the pandemic in order to reinvigorate consumption and investment, business activities as a whole, and employment activities in the United States. But our stimulus here in Trinidad and Tobago has actually been very, very negligible. So, for example, we hear about the SME loan facility provided by the banking institutions in conjunction with a guarantee, 100%, and the guarantee is now supposed to be 100% from the government, but yet still SMEs are very much unable to acquire these monies. These monies were very much undersubscribed last year, and they're still likely to be quite undersubscribed this year as well, even though about $200 million, just over $200 million has been allotted for that particular purpose. So we have to ask the question, is that $200 million enough? The answer is no. We have about $5.4 billion in excess liquidity as at a few days now, sitting in the commercial banks. That's money that's just sitting there doing absolutely nothing. When that money could be put to a lot more productive use by the micro and small businesses and the medium-sized entities in the country as well. It could also be put to use to help keep many of their employees on the payroll, sustain them at least at this point in time, until they're able to get back on their 2 feet and properly reinvigorate their operations. But again, the monies are just sitting there doing absolutely nothing for the various reasons that companies can't access loans because A, they may be unregistered companies, or B, because they may not have a good track record of profitability over the last few years, and they're not exhibiting any sort of real potential to increase their cash flow earnings in the short to the medium term. But let's face it, the vast majority of them are unlikely to show real potential of increasing their cash flow earnings in the short term at the very least, especially because of the effects of the pandemic. So the commercial banks or financial institutions as a whole need to take this into serious account and start disseminating these monies onto the private sector, especially the small and medium-sized companies. The government have already agreed to bear the burden of 100% of the risk. The risk has all been transferred now to the government. So if you can't pay off this loan, the government is obliged to be able to pay off that loan for you. Now, one way they could circumvent a lot of this is if they had formed, and it's still not too late in my opinion, they could still go ahead and do this, they could form an SME infrastructure development bank, where some of this money, I wouldn't say 200 million, I would say about 500 million at the very least, is used to capitalize this particular institution, which is then going to be put in charge of disseminating or providing these loans to the SME consumer, the SME businesses of the country. That way, the money gets into the hands of those that really need it, and they're able to use this money to continue their operations. Remember, this is 2 lockdowns that they're coming out of, not just 1, 2. How many of them pragmatically are really going to be able to survive 2 lockdowns? And the answer to that is actually very little. With less companies existing, with more going out of business, less people are going to have jobs, especially more so in the lower to middle income bracket. More householders' purchasing power is going to be substantially removed. And let's also face reality here. There are many individuals in the lower income bracket that tend to live paycheck to paycheck. They don't have adequate amount of savings. And at this point in time, much of that savings has been depleted. So what do you do then? That SME loan facility actually carries a lot more weight to bail out the private sector, to bail out the low income household levels. It carries a lot more weight than that it's actually being given credit for. And the state needs to accelerate that particular drive in getting those monies in the hands of the people. Now, this is where the Inter-American Development Bank could come in very, very handy. The IDB has a particular arm that is known as IDB Invest. And IDB Invest, part of their specialty is providing not just the credit, not just the capital to these financial institutions to get into the hands of the SMEs. They also provide training. They also provide support to be able to handle the risk management, especially the credit risk management to the banks for these particular SMEs. You remember, banks are really ought not to use the same credit model, the same model for assessing whether a big company should get a loan, whereas a small company should get a loan. They need to assess the small company using different criteria, using a different threshold, as opposed to how they assess larger companies and more profitable companies as well. They need to change their risk management criteria to take into account the effects of the pandemic. And this is where using the services of IDB Invest would come in handy. But we also have to look into the other side of things, which is the foreign exchange side. Remember, much of what we consume, over 90% on a daily basis of what we consume, are imported items. We don't have the capacity to produce them here just as yet. Much of the items used by manufacturers, especially for their production process, the raw materials, the various inputs, etc., are also imported. So they need more support with respect to foreign exchange. Now, we've seen an increase in the prices of oil over the last few months, especially over the last 6 months, and that has caused an increase in the US dollar purchases by commercial banks. So there's no reason why commercial banks cannot start to give more support to manufacturers, especially to provide them with more US dollars, which is going to help facilitate their operations better and therefore be able to provide more employment for persons in the country and reduce the poverty levels that we're continuing to see.
All right. We're going to have to close here, Valmikki, because we're coming up to the news. But I want to take out of our discussion there and the things that you've said. One, I don't think government is looking at the connectivities between collapsed and unable to return to businesses and its impact on individual lives, community, and family. And I don't think that the Ministry of Finance is very creative about its solutions, and I don't think that the central bank in engaging the banking sector is creative enough in coming up with the solutions. And people don't understand.
It's all easy way out mechanisms that just
Yes.
aren't working.
People don't understand that it's not just a failure of business, it's a failure of homes and communities and lives that you are talking about with each failed business. I want to thank you very much for coming here today and for having this discussion, which elucidates a lot of the issues surrounding what is happening to the country. Our per capita income has now fallen to about $15,000 because of a fall in GDP. The poverty level has been growing. The destitution level has been growing. The level of vulnerability has been increasing. And we need solutions for this. And we will have you back together with other people to talk about some of the solutions going forward. Thank you for coming to us on Brighter Morning with Bhoe this morning, and we hand over now to Shanil Alsuran for the news. Thank you very much.